Good to have you all tonight. Our clip-on microphone is not working, so I'm going to talk with one hand tonight. I'm not sure how good that's going to do. You know, my wife said one time that, some women, you can tie both hands behind their back, they can't talk, Anyway, welcome to Wednesday night Bible lesson. We are studying through the book of Esther. Anybody need a lesson sheet? If you don't have one, raise your hand, and we'll get one to you. I have on there all the scriptures that we will be looking at tonight. So we always like to start with a little bit of review in case you have not been with us the last few weeks. Obviously, we can't say everything, but this will kind of give you up and give you a context. I always believe that Bible study is best done in context so that you kind of understand where we've come from, so you'll know why we're here where we are tonight. We'll be in chapter 5 of the book of Esther. The review that we're going to talk about is the book of Esther the events of the book of Esther occurred between the 6th and 7th chapter of the events in Ezra. We did the book of Ezra before we did the book of Esther. This is about 500 years before the birth of Christ. We've talked about how the three books, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, in the Old Testament are actually the end of the Old Testament history. And then God is silent for about 400 years, and then Christ comes. And so we're kind of right at the end of Old Testament history. Pastor on the night that he teaches is in Genesis, so he's at the beginning of the Old Testament, so you're kind of getting the bookends of the Old Testament right now. So the book of Esther is kind of the history of the Jews that chose not to go back to the Promised Land. Ezra chapter 1, Cyrus was the king of Persia, the Persian Empire, and as prophesied by Isaiah, he allowed any Jew that wanted to return to the Promised Land after this 70-year captivity. And so we know that in Ezra chapter 1, about 50,000 men plus their families went back, but we know that there was probably over 1 million Jews that were taken captive. So many more than went back actually stayed there in what initially Babylon, then Persia overcame Babylon, so it was the Persian Empire. And so that's, as Esther starts, the king is Xerxes. If you have an older version, it says King Ahasuerus, which is the Jewish name for King Xerxes. And the events in chapter 1 of Esther are where King Xerxes is holding a series of events in preparation of the Second Greek-Persian War. Now, that's not mentioned in Esther, but we're late enough in world history now where we have a lot of external world history that coincides with the biblical account that kind of tells us what's going on at this time of the world. And so the events of chapter 1, he holds a banquet, then he has about 6 months of military parades, then he holds another banquet, this time for the citizens of the capital city of Susa. And at the end of the seven days, all the men are drunk. They have their own banquet. The women are having their separate banquet. And the king calls for Queen Vashti to come parade her beauty before all the drunk men. And she refuses, which kind of shocks the king. But basically, he makes a proclamation. He consults his advisors, like we would call the president's cabinet. And one of them suggests that she needs to be deposed as queen. And so the king agrees with that. And so a proclamation is sent to all 127 provinces of this massive Persian empire that has overtaken so many foreign countries. Proclamation is sent out to the 127 provinces that Vashti is no longer queen, and that every man is head of his household. So the idea is to prevent the female revolt based on Vashti telling the king no, she won't do what he asked him to. Anyway, and so between chapters 1 and 2, there's a 3-year period in which the Second Greek-Persian War was fought. We've mentioned how that's, if you've ever watched the movie The 300, where the Persians are attacking Greece and the Spartans hold them off at Thermopylae, that's when this occurred there between the first and second chapters of Esther. Anyway, Xerxes and his massive army are defeated by the Greeks, and so he comes back home to Persia, and so chapter 2 starts, and he's now finished the war, and so now he decides it's time for a queen. And so they have a queen contest. Basically, he asked for all the most beautiful virgins in the kingdom to be brought into Susa, and they are put into harem, what we called in our lesson harem number 1, where they are prepared for a year with beauty treatments for their audition with the king. And Mordecai was one of the Jews. He was apparently a fairly high government official there, and he was raising a young cousin of his named Hadassah. And he had a suspicion apparently that because of her beauty she was going to be chosen, and so he changed her name to Esther, which is a Babylonian name, because there was quite a bit of anti-Jewish sentiment already in that kingdom, and so he didn't want her to have a Jewish name, Hadassah, so he changed her name to Esther. Sure enough, she was chosen to be part of the group that was to be auditioned for the queen. The Bible doesn't tell us, but Jewish historians tell us that there were about 400 young women that were chosen for this. Each of them went through the year of beauty treatments. Anyway, Esther was part of this, and she eventually was chosen to be the queen. And then all of those who were not chosen became part of the king's harem number 2, which was the concubines. Anyway, so as a little background to how the rest of this story turns out is the queen and both harems, the ladies being prepared for auditioning for the king and becoming concubines, they are sequestered in this massive palace. And I think I showed you a picture of this palace that we actually have from history. So they are kept out of society. And so they really don't know what's going on out there in the world around them. And so that's their life. Once they're part of either the queen or part of the harem, they don't really get to ever go outside of the palace. And that kind of explains what goes on with the rest of this story. Anyway, so Mordecai, who's the cousin of Queen Esther, he stays at the gates of the palace because that's where business is conducted in those days. And he hears of a plot to kill the king. He lets Queen Esther know about that. She tells the king. Turns out it's true. And so the 2 guards that made this plot, most older versions say hanged, but actually the Persians didn't hang people with a rope. What their favorite method of execution was, they would impale the person's body with a sharp spear or spike, and then they would hang the body on a tall pole publicly to be an example to those who think they might want to do something unlawful. Chapter 3 then, this is 5 years later, so chapter between 2 and 3 is 5 years. And so Queen Esther's now been queen for 5 years, and we're introduced to a man named Haman, who is made prime minister or second in command of the kingdom by King Xerxes. And what we learn is that the Jew Mordecai, who is at the king's gate there at the palace, refuses to bow down to Haman because apparently everybody else is, but Mordecai fails to, and that really irks Haman. And to give you a little background of that, it was the Babylonians. You remember the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar and the statue he built of himself. The Babylonian kings considered themselves gods, and so that's why they did not bow down. This is a different situation here. The Persian kings were polytheistic, many gods, but they themselves did not consider themselves to be gods. Basically, it was Persian court etiquette that you would bow in respect to people at a higher position than you in government. You've probably seen television newsreels of when our president goes over to Japan and they bow to our president. You know, that's part of their etiquette of bowing to people to honor them. And so the idea that we get here is that Mordecai would probably bow to the king, but he would not bow to Haman. And so this is really irking Haman. And there's more to it. There's a story behind the story that we talked about. And the breadcrumb trail that's kind of left to us by the author is he tells us both of their heritages. Chapter 2, verse 5, we learned that Mordecai was a Jew. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and that he was a descendant of a man named Kish. And you may remember that King Saul was the son of Kish. So Mordecai was a relative, a distant descendant or relative of King Saul. Haman, chapter 3, verse 1, was a descendant of Agag. And you may remember from 1 Samuel 15, Agag was the king of the Amalekites. When the Israelites, years before that, left Egyptian bondage and were coming back, journeying to the Promised Land, the Amalekites, a pagan group, attacked them for no reason. And God, in Deuteronomy, was so angry with the Amalekites, he told the Israelites to always remember the sins of the Amalekites, and basically, when you get to the Promised Land, I'm going to have you wipe them out. And so, in 1 Samuel 15, God speaks to the prophet Samuel, who then tells King Saul, God tells you to go totally destroy the Amalekites. And Saul took his army and mostly did that, but didn't really complete the task. He brings back the best of the animals, and he brings back King Agag. And so the next day, Samuel says, I hear the bleating of cows and I hear the farm animals. What's going on here? This is not what I told you to do, what God told you to do. And this is when Samuel uttered that famous phrase that we've heard so many times, to obey is better than to sacrifice. Because Saul said, well, I brought back all the best of the animals to sacrifice. But he was disobeying. So it's much more important for us to obey God than to disobey him and think we can just go sacrifice something to make up for it. Anyway, so Samuel hacks King Agag to pieces, the Bible says. Now, nothing is said about Agag's wife. But again, Jewish historians tell us that Saul actually brought back King Agag and his wife from the massacre, and that she was pregnant. And that during the night, before they appeared before Samuel the next day, that she escaped. And that is how, because all the other Amalekites were killed except Agag. And then Agag's hacked to death the next day by Samuel. And so the Jewish historians tell us that his pregnant wife escaped in the night, and the Jews didn't worry too much about her because they still had the king. But apparently she had a son, and so there are descendants of Agag. And chapter 3, verse 1 of Esther, the Jews say he is Haman the Agagite, the descendant of Agag. You see, Middle Eastern people are a little bit different from us. I mean, we kind of remember maybe 2 or 3 generations back, but I mean, they are really big on genealogy. I mean, you can read the Old Testament and just see so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, and they memorized all that. They knew all their ancestors. They knew who their ancestors' friends were. They knew who their ancestors' enemies were. So it was natural here that Haman was well aware who Mordecai was, and so because of their ancestry, there's more to this story than just the fact that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. But that's the reason Mordecai would not bow down to him, because God had told them years ago, remember the sins of the Amalekites. And this guy represents the Amalekites. So anyway, so Haman gets angry. He plots to kill all the Jews, not just Mordecai, again, because the Jews killed all of his people. And so he offers to pay the king 10,000 talents of silver for doing this. And we brought up the fact that that is 375 tons of silver. At today's going rate of silver, that's $312 million. You say, well, how would a government employee get that much? Well, basically, he was going to confiscate that from all the Jews that he had massacred, because the Jews were very good businessmen then as they are now. Anyway, so Mordecai hears about the plan. He sends word to Esther. He's in sackcloth and ashes. We talked about that. Esther says, I can't go before the king because he hadn't called for me in 30 days, and anybody that goes before the king and he doesn't put out his scepter, instant death. So the guard just puts his sword right through you right then. And so Mordecai knows that this has to be done. So he again calls the eunuch that takes care of Esther, and he sends a copy of this decree that Haman has had sent out back to Esther, and he tells the eunuch to tell her, you were made queen for such a time as this. In other words, God didn't allow you to be queen for your own glory. There's a purpose for you becoming queen. You are to save your people. So Esther responds, okay, you have all the Jews in the whole country fast for 3 days, a total fast. Total fast means no food, no water, for 3 days. And then I will go to the king, and she says, if I perish, I will perish. Okay, that gets our review down to chapter 5, to where we are. So hopefully you kind of feel like you know what's going on now. So let's begin with verse 1 of chapter 5 there on your lesson sheet. So on the third day, so this is the third day of the fast, this is while she is still fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. So she's in the third day of her total fast. So she's totally denied her fleshly needs for food and water. She is totally depending on God because she knows she needs God to save his people. Now, as we've said before, in the entire book of Esther, it's an incredible story of God's providence and God's leading and God's guiding, and yet the name of God, the word faith, the word prayer, none of those three words are even mentioned in the entire book. Like we mentioned before, it's kind of like a boat and there's a rudder. The boat is the story, and the rudder is God guiding this. The rudder's not seen, the rudder's not talked about, but the boat is going where the rudder is turning it. So God is the rudder guiding the whole story because of his people and their faith in him. And then Esther is showing us the impact of one person, what power one person can have, when you're standing with God. If you go back to the history of the church, there's a lot of great leaders who went against the majority. Augustine, John Wesley, John Calvin, Martin Luther. Each one of them did not have an easy path because they stood against the vast majority, but they stood firm because they knew that what they were teaching, what they were saying, was true to God's Word. And yet, each of them had a major, major part in the history of the church because they were willing to stand up and be the power of one. And then I looked up just what one vote can do. Sometimes we get to thinking that my vote doesn't matter. Here's some examples of where even one little vote, we're talking about taking a vote, not making a big stand. We're talking about voting. In 1776, this is, of course, at the beginning of America, one vote gave newly formed America English as the official language rather than German. Interesting. 1845, one vote brought Texas into the Union. My family, I moved up here from Texas about 30 years ago, and my family, fifth generation Texan, they came from Indiana in the early 1840s to Texas because the Republic of Texas was giving away land trying to get Americans to move to Texas. And so they were giving quarter sections of land out, and my family settled near Bonham in northeast Texas. And I was one of the first Joneses to ever move out of Texas. So my family still thinks I'm crazy. Anyway, but I love Oklahoma. Anyway, 1876, one vote gave Rutherford B. Hayes the U.S. presidency. It was a deal where the Electoral College tied, and the U.S. House of Representatives had to vote on that. In 1923, listen to this, 1923, one vote gave Adolf Hitler control of the Nazi Party. In 1941, 12 weeks before Pearl Harbor, one vote saved the selective service system, the military draft system. How important do you think that was when Pearl Harbor hit? And then there on your lesson sheet, 100 years before the story of Esther occurred, so this is before the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, when Judah was basically becoming more and more pagan. And God had sent them prophet after prophet after prophet, trying to get them to straighten up and worship him and not worship idols. Ezekiel says in 22:30, I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it. But I found no one. So God was looking for a man who would stand up and be the difference in Judah, and he found no one. The power of one. So here in Esther 5:1, Esther is standing in the gap with the fate of the Jewish people on her shoulders, but she knows she's standing there with God with her. She's standing there physically, but she knows that basically she's standing there with God. And then she says, if I perish, I perish. Okay, verse 2. When he saw Queen Esther, this is the king, saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So the king sees Esther. She wins favor in his heart. And again, that's God, this unseen power, steering this story. God is guiding the ship. Proverbs 21:1, we see, in the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels toward all who please him. And so God is guiding this pagan king's actions towards God's purposes. So just because kings or presidents or dictators are in power, they don't intimidate God. No matter how much gold or silver is in the treasury, God is not intimidated. No matter how large a king, president, or dictator's country is, in this case it was 127 provinces, that does not intimidate God. No matter how big the army is, and we mentioned how Xerxes had an army of somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million, that does not intimidate God. So if that doesn't intimidate God, then God does not get intimidated by your boss, by your wife, by your husband, by your kids, by your ex-spouses, or by your enemies. Because the hand of the Lord, any heart is like water in the hand of the Lord. God has his purposes, and we are to become simply vessels who work through his purposes. So Esther's walking in confidence here, even though she's doing something she's never done before. Because the rule of law in the Persian kingdom is nobody comes before the king unless you're requested to come. If you come before the king and you have not been called, then basically you're a dead man, unless he holds out his scepter. So she's not trembling, she's not cringing, she's not cowering. She's standing tall and confident in the Lord because she knows she's doing the Lord's bidding. She knows that God wants to save his people. So the king does extend his scepter, saves her life, and what I want you to know right here is we know the end of this story. You know, I think that's something that we forget as we're reading these Bible stories. We know them. We know how they start. We know the middle. We know the ending. At this point, she doesn't have a clue what's next. She doesn't have a clue what's next. She's just walking in faith, doing what she knows to do, letting God guide her, and going to take it as it comes. Maybe she's going to perish after all. We don't know. Because at this point, there's an edict out that the king has, and the Persian kings could not change their proclamations. They couldn't go back on them. The edict is out there. It's been sent to 127 provinces. So she doesn't know how God's going to work this out, but she has faith that God is going to save his people. But the edict cannot be changed. Verse 3. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." So Esther doesn't know what he's going to say, but he says, "What's your request? Name it." Basically the same. By saying half the kingdom, he's saying there's no limit to what I can give you. Now, if you think about this, Esther could immediately, bring down the hammer on Haman, saying, "Haman got you to sign this edict, condemning all of my people." She could have just come out and said it right then. But, if you remember, the edict went out naming a day 11 months later as the date that this extinction or this massacre of the Jews would occur. So she's a wise woman. She's not in a hurry. She knows that there's 11 months before this is going to happen. But most importantly, she's letting God lead her, and she doesn't feel like this is the time to say that yet. And so she's waiting for that rudder to guide her ship. So, we can get a lesson from that. When we don't wait on the Lord, when we jump ahead, when we shoot from the hip, when we run off at the mouth, things don't turn out well. And then what do we tend to do? We tend to blame God because we haven't waited on Him. We haven't been patient. But when we do wait on the Lord, He gets full control of our spirit, and we're kind of like a glove on His hand. Remember on Ezra just kept saying, "The hand of the Lord did this, the hand of the Lord did this, the hand of the Lord did this." I think there were 6 times in 2 chapters in Ezra. And he talked about the hand of the Lord on himself. He talked about the hand of the Lord on the other Jews. He talked about the hand of the Lord on the King Artaxerxes, who was the son of Xerxes and Esther. And so basically what we are like a glove on the hand of God. We've got to be the glove doesn't decide what the hand does. The glove is along for the ride, so to speak. And the glove accomplishes the purpose of the hand. And so that's very similar to the rudder on the ship. And that's what Esther's doing here. She's being the glove on the hand of God, not trying to do what she thinks she's best, what she thinks is best. Okay, so let's see what Esther responds to the king when he says, what do you need? Verse 4. "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Okay, now this is incredible. Remember what day this is. This is the 3rd day of her total fast. She's had no food, no water for 3 days, nor have any of the Jews in the kingdom. But she's the one speaking here. And I don't know if you ever totally fasted for 3 days. I have not. I have fasted, but I've never totally fasted. Nothing to drink, nothing to eat for 3 days. So she's done that, and at the same time prepared a banquet fit for a king. That's kind of hard to do, isn't it? Now, Kathy does probably 95% of the cooking in our house. Me and the microwave are close friends. I can punch those buttons. But I just know that most people that cook, what do they do when they're cooking? They taste it. They want to make sure that it's, the balance of the ingredients is right, it's salted, it's peppered right, the spices are right. Esther puts nothing in her mouth while and she hasn't had anything for 3 days. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink, but she's cooking a banquet that is fit for her king. So I would say what she's doing here is really not humanly possible. This was the power of God working in her. And so this, once more, is an example of what I call God is at work in the waiting. She's waiting. She's waiting on God. She's not jumping ahead and doing what she thinks should be done or saying what she thinks should be done. And because she's waiting on God, God is working in her. God is at work in the waiting. He's filling her thoughts with a plan. Basically, God is speaking to her saying, give the king a banquet, invite Haman, and here's what you need to say. So during this 3-day fast, she's not thinking all the time about how hungry she is or how thirsty she is. She's concentrating on doing what God wants her to do and being the hand of God. And so she's praying, she's listening. She knows that God has to work through her to save the people. Now, notice what she doesn't do when she responds to the king. So her response is, let the king, together with Haman, come to a banquet that I prepared for him. Notice what she doesn't say. She doesn't point a finger at Haman. She doesn't rush ahead and tell the king, and she doesn't, what's bothering her, and she doesn't start crying. She just calmly says, I planned a banquet, and I'd love for Haman and you to come. And the king says, great idea. And as we've studied in our past lessons, Persian kings love big banquets. They love banquets. They had banquets for thousands and thousands of people, but they love banquets. And so here the queen herself has prepared a banquet, so he thinks this is a great idea. Verse 5, bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asked. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. So here we have the king and we have Haman, and we've been told in the previous lesson that the king had given Haman his signet ring so that he could make any proclamation he wanted. The signet ring was used to seal the wax or the clay on the documents to make it an official proclamation of the king. So, Haman's the prime minister, basically has the power over everybody except over the king. And so those are the two most important people in the kingdom, and here they are at the banquet with Esther across from the table. And can you imagine what she's thinking? Here these two guys are. They have no clue that I'm a Jew. And there's just been a proclamation sent out that we're going to kill all the Jews in the land. And I imagine she's kind of smiling. God's going to take care of this. These guys have no clue. I don't know what he's going to do. I know how he's going to do it, but I have faith in my God. And they have no clue that a Jew just made them suffer. And I bet it was kosher. Think about that. They probably wondered, why are we eating these certain foods and not eating other things, but never occurred to them. Anyway, so, I'm sure Esther's sitting there thinking, no, isn't God great? I could have been killed when I went before the king. Could have been killed. The king could have not held his scepter out and the guard run her through with a sword. But instead, just like God planned, he puts the scepter out. And then I invite them to a banquet, and they more than willingly come. This is just all falling into place, just like God kind of told me to do. It's happening. It's happening. It's like a surprise. And see, that's kind of how our walk of faith is supposed to be. It's supposed to be an adventure. Our walk of faith is supposed to be an adventure filled with periodic and delightful surprises. So she steps in front of the king with confidence, and she plans a banquet because she expected God to do the unexpected. And we have to expect God to do the unexpected. You know, sometimes we minimize God and feel like that, you know, he's just kind of like us, and so because we're limited, he's limited. But we got to have a bigger faith than that. Now notice that Esther still hasn't told the king what's troubling her. Still hadn't told her. He knows something. He knows something because that's why they're at the banquet. You know, he said, you know, what's troubling you? She said, I prepared a banquet. Well, she didn't answer the question. And so he knows something is troubling her. And so now he raises the matter again. So they're sitting there with Haman, and he asks her again, verse 6. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is it? What is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. This is great. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Isn't this perplexing to the king? Yeah, he's thinking, what in the world's going on here? Now, Esther could have done on the first banquet today what she's going to do tomorrow, but she's not doing it because she's trusting God's timing. You know, God's let her know this is how you need to do this. And so this is her second opportunity to tell King about the evil Haman and what he's doing to her people, but she doesn't do it because she's trusting God's timing. You know, God's timing is different for everybody. For Moses, it was 40 years. For Abraham to have a child, it was 25 years. For Esther, it's another day. So meanwhile, Haman, you know, the nasty guy that we love to hate, he's kind of getting in his mind that he's just a pretty important guy. You know, he's kind of strutting around like a peacock. Let's see what he does. Verse 9 and 10. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So Haman leaves the palace. He is in great spirits because he just had a banquet with just him and the queen. And he thinks, man, what an important guy I am. You know, you can imagine him at his office the next day bragging about, you know, this great banquet and all the food they had, and how he got the personal invitation from the queen. But just as he leaves the palace, he comes to the gate. Guess who's there? And, of course, everybody else, when they see Haman, you know, they're bowing down, bowing down, bowing down, bowing down. There's Mordecai just standing up, waiting for Haman to pass, like always. So Mordecai just, you know, refuses to give him the honor and respect because God had warned the Jews about that years and years ago, and he knew that Haman was an Amalekite, as a descendant of Agag. So don't you love Mordecai? I mean, I think he's as much of a hero of this story as Esther is. You know, he's kind of on top of everything. He's one more time he's in position to play his part in God's plan. You know, Jesus taught a lot in parables, so people could remember what he taught. And our pastor teaches a lot in parables, stories. One sermon from, 10, 12 years ago, he was talking about being in position for God to use you. And the reason I remember that sermon is because he used the parable, the example, the object lesson of a quarterback and a receiver. And a I think it was Jacob Dunlap was the receiver, as I remember. You know, we tend to remember things when they're told with stories. And so he was talking about how in football, the quarterback doesn't throw to the receiver, he throws to a spot. It's the receiver's job to be at that spot. So if the receiver is out of position, he can't make the play. So you see, that's the same with us and God. If we're out of position, God can't use us. So see, Mordecai is in position, so he can be a part of this grand plan that God's putting in place where he makes Haman so mad. See, the plan is to kill all the Jews in 11 months, right? Well, that's not what happens because Mordecai is in position. Let's see what happens. So he has changed. You know, he was in sackcloth and ashes. And when he was in sackcloth and ashes, he couldn't be at the king's gate because they don't allow people in sackcloth and ashes to be at the king's gate. So now he's changed clothes because Esther has said, if I perish, I perish. I'm going to go before the king. So Mordecai knows God's plan is going forward, so it's time for him to get in position. So he changes clothes. He gets back in his regular clothes. He goes and stands before the king's gate, and he knows that God is doing something. Again, he doesn't know this whole story. He just knows that something's going to happen. So he takes his position back up, and he obeys God, and one more time he doesn't bow down to Haman. And so Haman again is furious. You know, and he's thinking, okay, Mordecai, you're going to get what's coming to you in 11 months. But for now, he's still kind of proud about that banquet he was at, so he just wants to brag to his family, so he goes home. Verse 11, so he goes home. Haman boasts to his family about his vast wealth, his many sons. So the vast wealth, remember, he estimated that he would get $315 million worth of silver. The coins they used were silver. They're called derricks. And so if they collected the money when they exterminated the Jews, collected all the money that over 1 million Jews had, he estimated they have over 300 million. So he's boasting about all this money he's going to have because the king said, you can keep all that when you kill all the Jews. Just keep whatever you collect from them. So he's boasting about how wealthy he is. He's boasting about his sons, and we'll learn later in the story he has 10 sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. I don't know, have you ever been around a braggart? Yada, 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 brag, 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 me. You know, and you can imagine his family, if they're living with this guy, it's like, you know, but he's in charge of the family, and, you know, it's a real male-dominant society, so you just kind of put up with it. But you can imagine they're just kind of rolling their eyes and, you know, listening to him because they have to. Anyway, he's just kind of a conceited, arrogant blowhard. But what's interesting is here, you would think with all his wealth, so he's probably going to be the second most wealthy person in the world behind the king, with all his power, second highest power of the biggest empire in the world at that time, with all the glory of everybody bowing down to him except, you know, he'd be satisfied. But because one man won't bow down to him, it ruins all of his pleasure. You know, see, that points out to us a problem with the world. You know, the world, things of the world don't ever give us true, lasting satisfaction. Think about this. Have you ever heard of a billionaire who said, I have enough money? Have you ever heard of a politician say, I have enough power? Have you ever heard of a movie star say, I have enough fame? And the reason for that is because the things of this world are not satisfying. You get a little bit, you want more. You know, of course, in our own lives, you know, we think, well, if I just buy that thing, I'll be satisfied. Well, it gives us maybe a moment of satisfaction, but it's not long before we're wanting something else. I mean, we're all the same. We're all human. That's how the satisfaction of the world is not really a true thing. So Haman has all of this, much more than any of us will ever have, but he's not satisfied because one measly Jew won't bow down to him. So rather than dwelling on all the things he has, all the money, all the power, all the glory, all the fame, all he can think about is this Mordecai that just won't bow down to him. Verse 12 and 13. Be on the back of your lesson sheet. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany to the king to the banquet she gave, and she's invited me along with the king tomorrow, so a second banquet with the king. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So he's just focusing on his one area of dissatisfaction. So the family, who's so tired of hearing of this, comes up with a solution. They want to fix the Mordecai problem for this guy. So they give him an idea of how to fix the Mordecai problem. Verse 14. His wife Zeresh, bless her heart, and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, that's 75 feet. This is, I think Pastor said this is 44 feet here. So 75 feet is about 7.5 stories tall. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. That'd be really enjoyable, wouldn't it? Impale this guy, hang him on a 75-foot pole for all to see. Then you can enjoy the banquet with the queen. This suggestion, this is how sick this guy is. This suggestion delighted Haman. So he had the pole set up. Wonderful. Haman loves the idea, and he orders it done. So we mentioned how that was the method of execution. Like I said, the older version will say hanged on a gallows of 75 feet, but they impale them and they put them on a pole for all to see. So Haman's hatred has now consumed him to the point where only the immediate death of Mordecai would satisfy him. Not 11 months. See, the rest of the Jews, he's going to get rid of in 11 months. But now his family has said, go ahead, just have him killed so he quit bugging you every day. You quit thinking about him, quit talking about him. We're tired of hearing about this guy. Plus, obviously this is keeping you all upset. So just go ahead and get him killed. And so I'm sure that very night, he went out after the family told him that, and the workmen start working on that, so be ready by the next day so he could have Haman executed the next day. Okay, so that's kind of the end of chapter 5, and so we kind of look at our lessons from chapter 5. Number 1, wait on the Lord before making your move. So Esther told Mordecai, have all the Jews fast for 3 days, no food or no drink. And the implication is, again, it's not mentioned about praying, but why else would they totally fast for 3 days? And she said, I and my handmaidens will do the same. So basically, Esther is waiting for God to move, the Lord's hand to guide her with words and actions before she says anything to the king. So we should do the same. When a situation comes up, we don't need to rush out and try to fix it. We need to wait on the Lord for some direction from the Lord. Number 2, trust God to open doors and hearts. Patient and I were talking the other day about different translations, and this lady told me about one I had not heard of. It's called the Passion Translation. So I've been kind of reading there some during my quiet times. I looked at the base, who did it. It's a one-man translation, so it's probably not the best translation to use for doctrinal issue, but it really reads nicely. This is Proverbs 16:7. When the Lord is pleased with the decisions you've made, He activates grace to turn enemies into friends. Let me read that again. That's really, really neat. When the Lord is pleased with the decisions you've made, He activates grace to turn enemies into friends. And so God can open doors. He can open hearts. Like we said a while ago, there's nobody in your life that God can't work on, whether a believer or non-believer. And so we need to trust Him to do that, but also we need to be pleasing to God in our actions because we want Him to work in our behalf. Okay, number 3, ask God for enduring patience. Think about Esther, just how she longed to tell the king what Haman had done, because obviously there was a love between Esther and the king. And she knew that the king would not be happy if he found out that Haman basically had tricked him into forming an edict that would kill her. Yet she had this patience where she was just waiting on God and His timing, but I'm sure it was tough to do. Back in Ezra, we talked about a game of chess. Often in the game of chess, you have an opportunity to take the other opponent's a piece of their army, so to speak. But if you have another plan that takes patience, you can often get to the king. But if you take that piece, it kind of messes up your plan. In other words, if you're impatient, often you make it worse on yourself. And that's true in the Christian life too. If we are impatient and blurt out things and do things without waiting on God, we don't get the best results. So we need to ask God for enduring patience, especially in difficult situations, because timing becomes as important as actions. Timing becomes as important in actions. So we've got to wait for a situation for God to work through that for it to be the best outcome. Okay, number 4, ask for the courage of the Lord when facing an unprincipled enemy. Haman was an unprincipled enemy. And so can you imagine the courage that Esther took? She really probably had no idea whether Haman knew she was a Jew or not. Again, we don't know. And so it took a tremendous amount of courage for her to ask for a banquet with the king and Haman, knowing that Haman, the king, if you remember back in chapter 2, Haman had tricked the king into making that proclamation, bringing up accusations against the Jews in the kingdom, saying they're rebellious, they're not paying their taxes, they're getting ready to revolt. And so the king didn't know all this, of course, because it wasn't true. But the king said, you bet you can go out and kill them all. So the king, had no idea that his queen was a Jew. So he's an unprincipled enemy, and so it took her tremendous courage to just face him and feel assured that God was on her side and give her the courage that God was going to be victorious in this situation. Okay, then the last lesson is the power of one, but it's the power of one in us. We're, as a person, as a human, you're never going to win against the enemy. We're in spiritual warfare. And as Christians, the Holy Spirit lives within us. And so when we talk about standing up and having courage, or when we talk about waiting on the Lord, this is all about the power of the Holy Spirit in us to fight that spiritual battle for us. I thought of one of my favorite Christian singers is Jeremy Camp, and then one of the favorite songs he sings is called Same Power. And I'm going to have Bandy play that for us, because I thought of that when I read this story. I've got the words there on your lesson sheet. If you kind of look at the first verse, it says, I can see the waters raging at my feet. I can feel the breath of those surrounding me. I can just, Esther and then Haman sitting across the table. His breath is right there of the enemy. It's just right there in the power that this guy has over the kingdom. And then I can hear the sound of nations rising up. there was a strong anti-Jewish sentiment in Susa, the capital at that time. And then the next verse says, I can walk down this dark and painful road. I can face every fear of the unknown. So she's approaching the king, not knowing whether or not she's going to be killed or not. This dark and painful road. I can face every fear of the unknown. She doesn't know whether she'll be killed. She doesn't know when the banquet comes if Haman's going to announce that she's a Jew, that she's one of this group that's going to revolt and try to overthrow the kingdom. She doesn't know. But she's just taking her steps one at a time because by the power of God that she feels that's within her. And says, I can hear all God's children singing out. In other words, remember she told Mordecai, have all the Jews in the kingdom do a 3-day total fast. And so not just God in her, she knows the power of all of God's people, all praying to God that he would intervene in their behalf and save his people. And we, whether she was aware of this or not, we don't know, but we've talked about how over and over throughout the Old Testament, God intervenes to save his people because he's saving the lineage of Jesus Christ. He's not going to allow the lineage of Jesus Christ to be wiped out. So Esther is not queen for her own glory. She's simply a pawn in the hand of the Lord. She's simply playing her part in the big picture so that God can get his purposes done in this world.